I want to tell you a little bit about the project itself. The first author of the two papers that we've generated, this is the first one, is Jenny Schutz. Those of you who have been around USC for a while know that she was a professor here. She left here to join the Federal Reserve System. She's in Washington, D.C. now. And she is the one who actually received the Haynes Foundation grant to do this work. And upon her departure, she asked that I join her. And all along, Yunjin Shin has been the RA on the project. So this was a wonderful opportunity to me to go back. Some of you who know me know that I'm on a 7-year cycle in transit. You know, something comes up every 7 years and I can't stop myself and I have to write a paper. So Jenny gave me this opportunity to fill in my 7-year blank on transit with this. Okay, let me see if I can make this work. There we go. Yunjin and I are going to split this presentation. I'm starting out. For those of you who don't know Yunjin, she's a year 4 PhD student, about 2/3 through her dissertation. And it is actually quite relevant to this project. So the first thing you might want to ask is, why should we study the development impacts of rail stations in Los Angeles? So we'll talk a little bit about that. We will talk a little bit about theory. What would we expect in terms of development impacts? We will talk a little bit about what evidence there is. And then we'll move into the research approach, the data. We're going to give you some descriptive information. Then we'll give you some of our model results, and then we'll all talk about what all this might mean. So the first question, of course, is why should we study LA? And the answer is that Los Angeles County has made a tremendous commitment, and all of you are paying the taxes to support this, the sales taxes, to make a really big change in the way mobility works in Southern California. So far, the price tag is around $9 billion, but there's much more spending to come that's planned. And some of you, I think, know that LA Metro right now is very busy planning the next sales tax measure to place on the ballot to increase sales tax once again and actually extend the current taxes some decades. So this is a long-term, very large investment. At the same time, the county is certainly an auto-oriented place. Much of the city remains an auto-oriented place. And so you actually have to ask yourself, are we really going to be able to pull this off, even if we spend 20 or 30 or 40 billion dollars? And so the questions are about, does even such a large investment affect transit accessibility enough to actually move the needle in some significant ways? And do we see any evidence that it's happening? The very first rail system opened here in the early 1990s. So, you know, in some cases we have over 2 decades. Can we observe that anything is happening? And even if we do see that something is happening in terms of real estate development, economic development, and so on, increases in density, how do we know it's really the rail investment as opposed to other things, like, for example, supportive zoning and policies? So the little table here kind of gives you where Los Angeles kind of ranks in some big transit cities, right? So we are, but if we just look at the car mode share journey to work, we're way above everybody else, right? So San Francisco is a very different place from Los Angeles, and are we going to be able to actually affect people's behavior in significant numbers to move that 6.1%? All right, here's a little tiny bit of theory, and I apologize that this is not the figure I would have preferred, but I really didn't have another one sort of nearby. But when we think about any transportation impact, and this is sort of for all of you students in the master's program, this is your revisit of the transportation policy course in one slide here. But the traditional urban economic model that we use to think about how transportation and land use are related goes back to the old monocentric models, and by that we mean a city with only one center. So if you can imagine a world where a city has only one center instead of multiple centers, that's what we're talking about. And the theory says that basically we have a really neat system in that people trade off how much commuting costs they're going to incur, and cost is time plus money, versus how much they're willing to pay in terms of rent. And so at the end of the day, what we get is our little curve, let's say curve 1 here, and that curve reflects the change in rental cost or price of housing per unit with distance from the center of the city. If we invent something that reduces transport costs, then, and if you are in this very simple world of uniform transportation, then what we expect to see is a decline in peak. Well, I should have also mentioned that this rent gradient is also equivalent to the population density gradient. So when transport is cheaper, everybody kind of wants to buy more housing, right? And so what we see is a decline in peak density, the growth of a city spatially, and overall lower density. So that's the story, the historical story of automobility, right? So that we had this great invention called the automobile that greatly reduces transport costs relative to its competitor, transit, and it was a relatively uniform type of invention, right? Streets are everywhere, and so we saw this decline in density. So now we want to turn it around in Los Angeles with transit. So how does transit work? Well, transit's a network, right? And most people walk to transit stations. So what's really important, first of all, is the transit station going to get you to the network, right? And is that network going to take you where you want to go in a reasonable amount of time? If it does, then you might be really interested in locating near that transit station, right? And if lots of people are interested in locating near transit stations, and if lots of businesses are interested, then what we should see is kind of a similar peak to that we have drawn here. And that demand is going to drive up land prices, and it's going to result in more density. So fundamentally, what we want to look at in our study is, do we have any evidence of this phenomenon of increasing density and prices? Okay. But the world is not so simple, right? So there's all kinds of other considerations that we really have to think about in this case. First of all, in many rail corridors, we're not really increasing accessibility, because typically what we do is we locate rail where there's an awful lot of existing bus demand, right? So we get rid of the buses and we put in the rail because rail has more capacity. So essentially, there's not a great increase in accessibility within the network. Also, in a place as enormous as Los Angeles, even one entire line, which is billions upon billions of dollars, isn't so much of a change relative to the entire network, right? So even with these massive investments, we're really talking about sort of marginal increases in access, and so we don't know if these marginal changes actually will matter very much. A third point is that what if we reverse things entirely? And what if the rail program is more about changing land use than it is about changing people's travel behavior? Okay? So what if what my real objective is to use the transit investment as a way to make it possible to change zoning and other codes to promote higher density development, okay? So in that case, the higher density development is actually being driven by the incentives to development and really doesn't have anything to do with the rail station. So that's going to be hard to unscramble, of course. Another question is development anticipatory? When developers heard about the red line, did they scramble to buy up property along the right-of-way and near the stations before it was ever under construction? That can happen. Or did most of the effect come after the station opened and after it could be seen that there was some demand for the system? So we don't know. It could be both. It could be one. It could be the other. And then the last question is, how long does it really take? Many transit proponents would say that it takes 50 years before we can really see changes in land use. And nothing here has been, we don't have a 50-year investment. So maybe 20 years just gives us a few hints, and we'll learn a lot more in 30 and 40 years out. So what about the empirical evidence? Those of you who have probably taken my class know that, or some of you who are my students know that I often say, we've got, literally thousands of papers on this topic. Why on earth do we want to write one more, right? What is it that we could possibly contribute at this point? And the fact is that in those thousands of papers, we actually have very inconsistent results. And one of the reasons is that all these papers are different. So they use different measures, right, for how they're going to measure impacts, and I have listed some of the dependent variables that are most often used. They are very different in terms of the level of aggregation or disaggregation. Some studies look at an entire system, some studies look at transit corridors, some look at station areas, and of course all those things are different. And there's different levels of geography that have actually been used. We know that local conditions really matter. So when we have a lot of variation in local conditions, right, in terms of market conditions and transit demand and so on, we shouldn't be surprised that we get different answers. We also see a lot of variation in methods. There are a lot of papers out there that just track, I built 3 stations before the world looked like this, after the world looks like that, therefore the rail system had an effect. And of course, that doesn't prove anything. In some cases, these are detailed single case studies. In other cases, they're pretty formal and use quasi-experimental design, which is the route that we take. And then, of course, there's all kinds of differences in time periods. So what do we observe from that literature kind of overall? The first thing that we observe is that if there's going to be an impact, there really does have to be a significant change in accessibility. And so usually the first units of a new system will have much more effect than the last unit. If you want to see change in development, you have to have favorable market conditions. it's very hard to use infrastructure investments as a way to promote long-term economic development. You need to have supporting zoning and parking and traffic policies. As you all know, in most of Southern California, we get to park for free, not at USC, but most other places we get to park for free. And we hand out all kinds of different subsidies to the automobile, and then we ask ourselves, why is transit use not increasing? And probably if we had supportive policies, transit use would increase. Also, typically the most successful places involve subsidies from the public sector. And finally, most impacts are highly localized, right around these station areas. Los Angeles is no different in terms of having successes and non-successes in station area development. These are two that have actually experienced a great deal of development, and in our second paper are subjects of detailed case studies. These are a couple that have not seen any significant development at all, and there's a story as to why for both of them. And again, we use these as case studies to sort of support and better understand our empirical results that we're giving you today. So I'm going to go back to my question that I sort of asked at the outset: why should we have another study on rail impacts? And so here's our reasons. There hasn't been nearly as much done on the employment side as there has been on the housing side. There haven't been, as far as we know, many studies that actually use a comprehensive set of measures, and that's what we're doing. There aren't many that use an annual series of comparisons over a number of years, and in our case we have for some stations up to 20 years of annual data, which allows us to look for both pre and post effects. And then of course LA is really unique and interesting, right? Because it's really trying to change the way the city looks. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Yunjin.
So I'm going to explain the empirical approach of our study. So I'm going to remind you our research question. So what we are interested in is whether Los Angeles is becoming transit-oriented. In other words, our research question is whether there is any evidence of changes in economic activity, such as housing and employment outcomes. And another questions that we'd like to answer is the time frame questions. So we are wondering about the time frame in which development occurs. So in order to compare the station areas to counterfactuals of what would have happened without the stations, we actually create the quasi-experimental design using longitudinal data set. And so we actually also selected control areas that are matched to rail stations. So this map shows the rail stations included in our study areas. So we used 27 stations that opened between 1992 and 2003 that are on red, purple, and gold line stations. Because of the data limitations, we dropped the blue line because that opened in 1990, it's too early. And we also omitted Expo line because it's too recent. And we also omitted the green line stations because green lines are located in the middle of the highway. So it's really hard for the development to occur right near the stations. So we use the rail station areas as the quarter-mile or half-mile buffers of the stations. So it's really classy definition, but the size of the buffers really depends on the transit density. So in central LA, we used quarter-mile buffers because there are many of the stations are located close to each other. But for other areas, we use the half-mile buffer and it doesn't give any overlappings between station areas. One of the strengths of our studies that already Professor Giuliano mentioned is to use the longitudinal data set, which is establishment level and property level data set. We use national establishment time series establishment data set, and this is a private vendor data source which has the information on business name and the geocodes of the businesses, number of employees, and industrial sector. And we use the DataQuick database for the housing variables. So basically, this is the property level data set on housing transactions. So this has the information on sales date, sales price, and the number and the types of properties sold during the last 2 decades. In addition to these two major data sources, we use several census data to control for economics and demographics variables. So this map again shows the station areas in our study area, and this shows the actual station opening dates. So our station areas offer the great variations in opening dates, and also they are very diverse in terms of their neighborhood characteristics and their place characteristics because they are located across the city. And this shows the control areas, and this yellow circle shows the station areas, and the size of the control areas are actually same as those of the station areas, those of the nearest station areas. And the control areas are located between half mile and 3 miles from the station. So basically they are outside the station influence, but they are still close enough to have similar place characteristics such as demographic characteristics and economic characteristics. And all of these control areas are actually located along the major road intersections because stations are also located on the major road intersections. So many of the control areas actually share the same streets with at least one of the stations. So we selected 48 control areas. So based on these selected control areas and station areas, we used difference in difference estimation approach. The equation 1 shows the basic DID estimation equation. We sort of tweak this estimation approach in order to adjust for pre-station opening effects. So in other words, as Professor Giuliano mentioned, it is possible that there are some anticipation effects before station opening. Maybe developers might move quickly before station opening because opening dates were released several years before the station opening. So the coefficients of our interstices are the beta 5 in the second equation. So this indicates the post-opening effects in the station areas relative to control areas. We have an extensive set of the dependent variable. As for the employment outcomes, we look at the employment density for sure, but we also look at the employment share by industry sectors such as commercials and industrial employment. And as for the housing variables, we look at the housing sales volumes, number of newly built units, and types of properties sold, and the housing price per square feet. Although we very carefully designed our research, there were some challenges to identifications of our station impacts. There are many challenges, but one of the major challenges is to policy intervention, which is land use regulations in our case. There were 2 main changes in station areas during the study period, and the first one is the adaptive reuse ordinance. So this ordinance was adopted by City of Los Angeles Council in downtown area in 1999, and it was expanded to other parts of the city in 2003. So this ordinance basically aims to promote the conversion of vacant commercial units to housing units. So they expedite the approval process, and they also remove many of the zoning requirements to promote the commercial development, to promote the housing development. And in 2005, state density bonus program is adopted. So the City of Los Angeles grant a developer 35% bonus, density bonus for housing project constructed within the 0.28 miles of the transit stops. Although these might affect our outcome variables, we conclude that this should not be a major threat to our research. First of all, there is no reason to think about this adaptive reuse ordinance has different effects on station areas compared to control areas. So theoretically, this ordinance should have similar effects for both areas unless there is some significant difference in vacancy rates. And the more major threat is the state density bonus program, because this program is actually targeting at station areas. However, this is adopted in 2005, and our study period will end 2009. Considering the length of the construction period, we don't think this actually greatly threat our research findings. So before going to the regression results, I'd like to show you the descriptive statistics. So this shows the pre-development patterns in station areas. So I'm going to compare station areas to control areas and the rest of the county. And as you can see, in station areas, there were higher employment density in the first place. You might argue that, oh, there seems to be big difference between control areas and station areas. But control areas are still much closer to station areas than the rest of the county. So this justifies our selection of the control areas. And also, if you look at the employment mix, in station areas, there were a higher level of commercials in the first place. And let's look at the housing market variables. And this table shows that in station areas, there were more multifamily housing stocks in 1990 before station opening. And other population characteristics are not that different between stations and control areas. But if you look at the household income in station areas, the household income is lower than control areas and the rest of the county. And this graph visually shows the changes in employment density pre and post opening. And this actually confirms the results in previous slide. So in the first place, the employment density was much higher in station areas, but these trends hardly changes over time. And if you look at the difference between station areas and control areas, they are actually go parallel. So there seems to be almost no difference in between these two areas. And if you look at the housing sales volume, actually this graph shows some more cyclical variations. And this graph is opposite to the previous one because in the station areas, there were less housing sales volumes. However, if you look at the difference between stations and control areas, there seems to be almost no difference over the time. And let's move on to difference analysis result. You might remember that one of the important questions that we raised is the time frame question. So we are wondering on a time frame in which this development occurs. So we use different levels of time window. And let's look at the first row first. If you look at the station coefficients, this actually confirms our descriptive statistics results. So in all years, in station areas, there were higher employment density. And these station interaction terms of stations and year posts are our key interest variables. And if we use the narrow time window, we didn't find any statistically significant impacts. But if we widen this time window, we found that 5 to 10 years after station opening, there seems to be some increase in employment density in station areas compared to country areas. But it's really hard to interpret this result because you might remember that the Gold Line actually opened in 2003. And our study period ended around 2009. So we cannot actually observe 5 to 10 years post-station opening effect. So we are not sure this result is because development occurs later, or this is because the characteristics of stations that were built earlier. And we also look at the employment share by industry category because it is easy for change employment share by industry category rather than employment density because you don't need to construct any new building for the changes in employment share. So, and we actually found very similar result. We didn't find any changes within 5 years after station opening. But 5 to 10 years after station opening, we found that there are some gains in public and institutional employment shares in station areas compared to country areas. And let's move on to housing outcomes. So we look at a bunch of housing outcome variables. So the first two columns shows the housing sales volumes per 100 acres. And the third and fourth column is the newly built housing units. And we also look at the percent of single-family housings in sales and the housing price per square feet. And as you can see, if you look at this line, the stations and year post-interaction term, there seems to be almost no changes in housing outcomes regardless of the time window. We only found that there seems to be some changes in housing price. However, the direction of the coefficients is opposite to our expectation. We control for other economic trends, and we also fixed geographic markets. So this can be interpreted that in station areas, housing price grew by less than in country areas. Maybe this probably has to do with the housing market characteristics in station areas, because in station areas, there were more multifamily housings than country areas, as we saw in descriptive statistics. But as for this result, we need further investigation. And I'd like to also emphasize that as for the housing price model, we omitted the station areas and country areas, which have less than 10 housing sales per year. So a bunch of the downtown station areas actually dropped in this model. And so this result should be interpreted with the caution. And Professor Giuliano will talk about the conclusion.
This just summarizes the points that I think Yunjin actually made in her presentation. As hard as we tried to create control areas that were very, very much like the station areas, as you saw, they really had some substantial differences, even though they were within a mile of each other. So we have things that we just can't control, even with the control places that we used. And so one was about the density, and the second is definitely about multifamily. And sort of another dimension of multifamily is that the DataQuick data only has single sales, so we don't have rental units. So there's no rental buildings being exchanged in that data set. So we think that we have less of a good set of observations for the station areas because we're missing more of what is actually going on there. You saw that the results on employment changes were mixed. In most of the results, the answer is no change, with just a few of these things coming up. And in particular, our observation of the employment increases in that longer time period for some of the stations that opened in the 1990s. And if you can remember the map that we showed you, that was essentially the west central area. And so, as you know, that's kind of the Wilshire Corridor area, extreme transit demand and extreme density and demand for location in that particular area. And then, of course, we saw that little blip in public or institutional employment shares. That's actually common around the country because one of the ways that public agencies want to promote transit-oriented development is by putting public activities there as well. And then, of course, we have this sort of odd result in terms of housing prices. I've already mentioned that, you know, one of the weaknesses of what we've done here is that we don't have good data on the rental side, at least in this particular data set. We also had no controls for zoning or other policy interventions. All that we did was actually divide the world into 5 markets. And it became clear to us when we were looking into the results that, for example, there's a big difference between Pasadena and Los Angeles in terms of how Pasadena has very systematically identified a way of promoting transit through zoning and so on. The story in Los Angeles is much less systematic. And we think that 20 years is probably actually not long enough. And of course, many of the stations in here we didn't have for even 20 years. So it would really be good to come back, say 10 years from now and do this again. So some kind of final points to kind of seed the discussion so that we can go into question and answer period here. It seems to us, at least, that if transit is a relatively minor player in the mobility world, then the land use policy side should matter more than it would in other places, right? So in a purely market-driven world, if we were looking at extreme transit demand, then the market would be generating, right, that desire for location and so on, as we talked about in theory. But if there isn't that market demand, then the policies that cities implement are going to make a really big difference in terms of what actually happens there. And then, of course, in the long run, what you really want to ask yourself is, even if we get all this density on the ground, are we really going to generate the travel behavior changes that are sort of an underlying objective here? The other thing to think about is that I think we all know that routes and station locations are not necessarily located on purely market-driven basis, right? There's a lot of political influence on where stations are. And, you know, sometimes stations are not in the best place with regard to the market, right? So if we have a sample of a bunch of stations, some of which are in really strong markets, some of them are in weak markets, we shouldn't be too surprised that we don't get much in the way of significant results. For sure, the current system, as it has been laid out so far, doesn't have much connection between the major employment centers that we've identified in the region. I think we could talk for a long time about differences in local zoning and government actions. That was actually the reason that we were driven to doing some case studies after we finished this work. And although that's not the topic of this particular presentation, the case studies did reveal that local conditions, and in particular the policies that cities were taking and community support, et cetera, really made a difference in the outcomes from station to station. And then finally, the last question is, of course, how long is long enough? So with that, we will open it up for questions. Thank you.
That was an excellent presentation. I really, really enjoyed it. And I'll probably need some help formulating my question. Is it possible that price per square foot is a sufficiently nonlinear function that it could partially explain some of the non-intuitive results that you got in terms of that conclusion.
Did we ever try different?
I think we used the log format of the housing price. So we already tried the nonlinear relationship between housing price and station effects.
Because there's a weird curve in the price per square foot function, and there are different curves for different types of housing. And so there'll be a bias if there's more dense development around a station to a particular type of housing construction, and that will jump your price per square.
Right, yeah, we did control for is it single family or is it condo, but that was all we could do.
That's a really tough aspect.
Sort of two related thoughts. One, you have one of your dependent variables is price per square foot, but the other factor that affects pricing is the supply. And so I was wondering if you had looked at the number of housing units that were built in station areas versus non-station areas.
Yes.
Because another piece that feeds into that is that in your 5 years out, you have a lot of your stations opened in 2003 on the Gold Line. 5 years out, the whole world collapsed, right? And the housing market collapsed, the economy collapsed.
Right.
So maybe there was anticipatory supply, and then the market just wasn't there.
Yeah, I put that slide back up so you can see that we did sales per for 100 acres and new units. So we did look at the new units, and remember that we have year controls in every single. We haven't shown you any of the control variables, but we have the year controls in there just precisely for that reason, because of the ups and downs of the market.
I have a question about you mentioned an anomaly with the Pasadena area, which is the only non-city of Los Angeles portion of the transit lines that you studied. Has there been any thought the fact that Pasadena is a different demand? It's much higher demand, higher income level, higher job growth, and were there any conclusions you were able to draw out of the 6 stations in Pasadena that changed your results?
I'm going to go back to our...
More employment growth in that area?
That was one of the reasons we did these market control groups. Now, these are, of course, not scientific. we should be clear on that. These are sort of rough divisions, and we did think about this, and we did try a couple of things. But the main point here was to try to get to actually control for market differences. Now, one of the things we found is that these markets are amazingly local, because one station next to another can have completely different outcomes. So that's for sure.
And also, we didn't show here, we also ran this regression for different market areas, but there seems to be no difference across markets.
And again, because we didn't show any of our control variables. There was another question, yes?
Yes, was there interest in, or is it possible to decouple the 2 corridors, I guess? And my question really isn't so much about the actual transit corridors, but more so kind of the transit technology. So one is a heavy rail subway, and the other one is a light rail. Is it possible to study or look at that?
Some of that, if it were really an issue, some of that would come through with our control variables, because you see that the vast majority of the Gold Line is in that far right box, and everything else is the subway. So that I think we have control for. Would you agree?
Yes, so if we control for geographic market, and the technology part really depends on which metro line you're talking about. So I think we sort of control for your concerns.
Yes.
I'm not, excuse me, very much into the math of it, but if you don't mind, I'd like to ask a policy question. NIMBYism, and if we can create a new one, INBYism, in my backyard, as you said. Some of the stations are placed because of political influence. So if we're doing things, but the incentivization, motivation is not there, we're actually asking for failure.
Right.
So it's not a surprise, perhaps, that you're not finding the results that everyone expects. So all of this money is spent on something that looks excellent and socially innovative, but on the other hand, because the foundations are not correct, public-private partnerships, incentives for people to move into the area and lower housing, rental type of stuff. If we do all of that together, then perhaps the success would be much more evident.
Yeah, and let's not blame politics entirely. I want to go back to this slide. Civic Center Station, nothing has happened there, okay? Nor should we expect it to, because it's located at the edge of Great Park. What's the percentage? About 80% of all of the employment there is public. Yes. It's zoned specifically for a public use. So there actually is no room for development. And so we shouldn't expect it. I wouldn't call that a failure. It gets people to City Hall, right? And a lot of other places. So I think we also have to be careful about what we're actually calling something that doesn't succeed. That's an essential station in the network itself.
But I apologize, let me follow up on that. That's one station, and there are other stations that
Oh, yeah.
are necessary regardless of whether you're able to see higher employment or housing.
Mm-hmm.
But then once you move outside of those areas, there's plenty of opportunity for incentivization.
Right. Right, and this Highland Park station is a very different story that has to do with actually no local consensus on what that area should be. So it's kind of not being anything. So nothing is happening right now.
The 27 stations have park and ride facilities, and if so, would that have a potential effect on some people?
I don't remember how many of them do you have park and ride?
We don't have data information on that part.
But we would have the land area because we know what the land uses are and everything. For sure, if there's park and ride, it takes away area that could be developed for something else, unless you're very creative, right, and put parking structures on the bottom of underneath buildings, but those are really, really expensive. So that's absolutely true. And what you see sometimes in other areas, and probably we'll see here too, is that as the system matures, there's so much more demand for location that the parking gets kind of crowded out. Yeah.
But I would think that park and ride would have a separate effect as well, and that is potentially to extend the interval.
Correct.
Of which you would have to separate your control because it's
Right.
easier to get to, so it's like virtual.
It's got a bigger market, right. And typically the end stations of lines have that function. They usually have much larger market areas. Okay, there was one more question.
I'm sorry, yeah, thank you very much for this presentation. I'm sorry, my question is a bit broad, but so I understand from your results that Los Angeles is not massively becoming transit-oriented, not very,
Not yet.
not yet. So to what extent do you think these results, like what is the Los Angeles effect in your results? To what extent are these results generalizable and as opposed to like the case of Los Angeles, which is a very specific city to many regards? How much does it explain these results?
That's kind of a philosophical question, I think. As I said at the beginning, this is an effort to totally restructure a city, right? So this is a very long-term program. And it is based on an expectation that if we change what we provide in the way of transit, and if we seed the market by subsidizing development around stations and so on, that we will in fact get a better world, more sustainable world, etc. I haven't seen that, right? We have no precedent really for this kind of a restructuring, which is what makes it really very interesting. I gave you the journey to work mode share of 6% on average for the county of Los Angeles. The transit share is really low. So the transit market now is really thin. So how much are you going to be able to do until the market gets much thicker? So I think that's one of the things that's interesting to me, is to be able to be doing this in such a thin transit market. Now, Los Angeles is not alone, right? Charlotte, North Carolina thinks it's going to have a transit-oriented future. And the market there is even thinner than it is in Los Angeles. So this is not uncommon. But the scale of it is definitely impressive. And also the fact that the public has voted for 3 different tax measures to do this is also a huge symbol of consensus and belief that this is actually going to happen. Question in the back?
I have a question on the recent announcement that Metro is going to be charging for parking at a lot of its regional stations. And I wonder what impact that might have on riders if they're trying to attract riders to transit, and because it's affordable, having to pay for your pass and your parking on top of that. Is that going to have a negative impact on people who say, you know what, it was worth it before and now it's kind of a break even and I'm much more comfortable in my car?
Actually, we look at the travel survey data set, and I cannot remember the exact number, but large share of the transit riders actually walk or bike to and from stations. So I think that the increase in parking fare should not have big impacts on the transit ridership. And would you like to add?
Yeah, at the margin, the price increase will definitely throw some people off of transit. But in the scheme of things, as Yunjin says, the vast majority of people walk or bike to transit.
From a personal, when you were mentioned earlier, the inlines, I would disagree with. I actually get on at an inline and the parking around the station is horrendous. There are a lot that do come on public transportation, but on the inline, the parking situation is quite severe. And so now
You mean insufficient supply? Yeah, that's what I was saying, that the end lines have a much bigger market. And that's exactly, and if it's a spatially bigger market, you end up with people driving because nobody's going to walk 2 miles. Yeah, yeah. And that's where the impact will be. Okay.
Thank you.
I think we're done. Okay, thank you.